too.
I just saw him. So I don't know when the program for Redacted will air, but we do have it set up for next week. So that's all.
What is next? I'm telling you, we're just working our way up the ladder.
Yeah, so that's exciting news. Okay. Yay. And also, let me go ahead and mention so that anybody listening to this later will know. Tonight, hold on, let me get to my calendar here. Tonight, we will be doing a space with the Cuban audience that about Cuba specifically, and it is something that we covered when we very early on in our research when we started the Spaces program. There are in the archives on that link on my pinned post about Cuba and the CIA's operations inside of Cuba, just so that you guys know that that's out there. You don't need it because I'm basically going to go over all of the information and add some information that I found out since then. So just so that you know that. And is that at 9 o'clock tonight, Bridget? If you could find in the DMs, there's a note from him. I'm pretty sure it's at 9 o'clock tonight, Eastern time. Okay. All right. So let's start where we left off, which was with Mitterrand, and he had just recently got notice that he was transferring to the schoolhouse in Washington, D.C., which explains in part why some of his kids, in any search that you do of his family members, the oldest 3 or 4 of them remained in Washington, D.C., and on his obituary, it actually said that they were there. And I also recently discovered that his oldest son is Dan Mitterrand Jr. And weirdly enough, he was picked up for drug related charges. So, for whatever it's worth. Okay. This part here starts off with him having a discussion with another instructor, and says the other U.S. advisor said, if anyone ever asks you what to do with prisoners, tell them this story. Right now, as we're talking, my fellow policemen are holding a man involved in a kidnapping. He and 2 of his accomplices took a little 5-year-old blonde girl who belongs to a businessman in the city. They're saying that if they don't get $2 million, that they're going to kill the child. We picked up the man while he was leaving instructions. We've had him now for 10 hours, and he told us nothing. The businessman doesn't have $2 million. He's wealthy, but not in that league. The deadline is getting closer. What do you do next? The Brazilian student said, there's no little girl. The other instructor says, the person who asked you the question can't be sure of that. Somewhere every week or month, if not every day, police officers have to face this type of problem. It might not be a little girl. It might be a policeman standing on a corner that some nut has decided to shoot. It's the same principle. The response, and if the man who asks you about torture doesn't agree that you should use any means necessary to find out where that little girl is being held, then don't answer any more of his questions, because he'll never understand what you tell him anyway. In other words, if you don't agree with torture to get information based on allegations, then you're not cut out to be their type of police, and you're not cut out for training at the Office of Public Safety. Lincoln Gordon, who we know as the ambassador, the coup had first seemed to fulfill his every expectation. Mazelli, the civilian vice president, was a dignified lightweight. If the military agreed to let him serve as president for the 4 months specified by law, that would have satisfied the ambassador. Instead, Gordon was informed that the new president would be military general Branco, which seemed to satisfy CIA operative Walters, the military attaché, and everyone else on the staff. The first clue that things might take a bad turn came when Francisco Campos, a lawyer whom Gordon regarded as an unintelligent fascist, drew up the first institutional act. Under its provisions, the government would, by decree, create a political death, a deprivation of all political rights for 10 years. Its victims would have neither a hearing nor an appeal. Moreover, they were being identified by General Golbery, the chief of intelligence there, as it says that Brazil's enemies were inside her borders. Golbery was not burdened by the restrictions of any constitutional right. They basically put the Brazilian Constitution aside and started making up rules of their own. Just as the act was about to expire, it was invoked against Kubitschek, which was a shock to the U.S. Embassy. According to one U.S. scenario, Kubitschek was to be elected to the next full civilian term as president. As it turned out, there was not going to be any more elections. The military decree that Branco was serving under was extended for another year. And that frustrated Carlos Lacerda, who was hoping to become president of Brazil. The bitterness and disappointment led to many more joining the resistance. Gordon sought out a friend in the new government, Milton Campos, to protest the military's high-handedness, since the ambassador had urged Branco to appoint Campos as a justice minister. Campos was obliged to hear out Gordon as he denounced the institutional act. What would Washington say, Gordon demanded, or the world? At least create a special court, some appearance of legality. He didn't give a crap if it was a kangaroo court, but the U.S. ambassador is impressing upon the new dictatorship that they just installed that you have to at least keep up appearances. 2 weeks later, Campos resigned from his post. But word got back to Branco, who called him the ambassador into his office. He had been president slightly more than 2 months. He assured Gordon that Kubitschek also troubled him, but he pointed sorrowfully to a massive document on his desk, and basically it was a file that supposedly was documentation of Kubitschek being a bad guy. If we were to publish the reasons for his corruption, there would be a taint to Brazilian pride. Gordon accepted the explanation. He felt like he had no other choice. CIA agent Walters, whom the ambassador considered a student of Brazilian politics, didn't seem troubled about any of it. 18 months after the coup, there was a special institutional act. There was a second, institutional act. I was uncomfortable with the first one, he told Branco, but it was for a limited duration. I assumed that when the emergency powers expired, we'd get back on the road. This is setting a dangerous precedent. Branco said that he was not happy either, but things were just not safe enough to not keep basically martial law going on. He had accepted the emergency powers only from the highest principles. There's no high principles associated with creating a military dictatorship. Two politicians from the token opposition party had recently been elected to governorships, he bragged. Gordon left the office, and by the time the fifth institutional act had been enacted, which included the shutting down of Congress, suspended habeas corpus for political crimes, and gave full power to the president, Gordon was no longer the ambassador to Brazil. Gordon's successor, John Tuthill, considered a number of reprisals against the latest act. One, which was not taken, would have been the full withdrawal of U.S. police advisors in Brazil, like that was ever going to happen. Robert Kennedy visited Rio in 1965 and agreed to meet with students at the Catholic University. By that time, few Brazilian officials would risk visiting a campus, and Kennedy got good marks for his courage. Otherwise, the rally drew mixed response. One of the people there, Jean-Marc van der Weide, observed that more of his classmates knew about Brazilians' history, and what was very suspicious about Kennedy's visit. Jean-Marc was a very intelligent, high energy person. And during the 1964 coup, when Lacerda had asked his supporters to rally at the governor's palace, he was there. Sure that Gouliard intended to become another Vargas, Jean-Marc had dashed to the palace, where he found no signs of resistance. His father was a Swiss chemical engineer and had worked for U.S. Steel in Brazil. He had married a local Brazilian woman, and they lived a very comfortable life. Jean-Marc's college experiences were leaving him completely disillusioned with the military government. He had resisted blaming the U.S. for Brazilians' dictatorship, but it was obvious that based on the aftermath and the U.S. coming in and buying up all of the privatization that was going on under the military dictatorship, he began to see what was really going on. And all of his classmates were basically saying, this is what U.S. imperialism looks like. It is under the cloak of covert operations. These the U.S. Oligarchs will come into countries after they help with the overthrow and the installation of a military dictatorship. So, without going through a lot of the details here, basically Jean-Marc decides that even though he has a lot of, he ends up graduating with his degree in engineering, but a lot of there wasn't a lot of jobs for the locals because people of that caliber was being brought in from the United States. And so he was at a coffee shop, and a bunch of cops come in that were trained by the Office of Public Safety and basically starts arresting students in this coffee shop. And Jean-Marc was clubbed by a couple of police who U.S. advisors were teaching to become more efficient. Jean-Marc's next political lesson was a little bloodier. There was a student that was shot to death during a demonstration that was pivotal in the gaining strength of the rebellion forces in Brazil. They were basically having a protest in front of a local um, food place that supplied food for the students while they were going to school. And their protest was that the food was not edible. And for that, one of the students got shot. So he decides that he's not interested in pursuing his degree as far as a job goes. And he finds out, so he starts basically talking to a lot of the resistance people, and he finds out that the IMF is going to have a meeting in Rio, and that was very close to this food shop for the students. And they decide that they're going to hold a rally. And the local government in Rio wanted to shut down that particular because food shop because they saw it as a magnet for some of the rebellious students. And so the students decide that they're going to not only not shut that down, they're going to go in and hold a rally while the IMF was there. And again, there was more bloodshed. So, after all of that happens, Jean Marc ends up, let's see. So after the second murder that happens by the police, 5,000 students marched 3 miles to a cemetery to bury the most recent victims. The police did not intervene on the procession, but there was a significant police presence, and they were basically taking names, taking pictures so that they could later identify any of the people that was at the funeral. So the day after the funeral, President Costa Silva, the hardline general named by the military to succeed Branco, used the rally as his reason for banning a political movement called the Front. It had been put together by Lusarda. And that was his one last attempt to basically open up the politics in Brazil. Lusarda responded that the ban demonstrated that Silva's regime was a military dictatorship in the worst Latin American tradition. Ambassador Tuthill also came under attack when it was revealed that he had been meeting with Lusarda and listening to him complain about the US government's role in the coup. So, Jean Marc decides that he's going to get involved in trying to change what's going on. So he and his colleagues called for a strike, and to generate support, Jean Marc was chosen to speak on television. At that time, television and press were not totally censored. On their screens, viewers were confronted by Jean Marc's well-spoken address. He basically said that he wanted the university open to everyone, to increase its funds and keep it free from government intervention. The last point interested the former union organizers who were forbidden to speak so directly. Jean Marc's group attracted a wider and more aggressive following until by the end of May, students from other facilities began to vote to expand the protest into a general strike. Before calling their walkout, the students tried to petition the Minister of Education with their grievances. The police blocked them from even gaining access to the government building. They found 20,000 police from all over Rio on the call, ready to address the group that had showed up at the ministry. Jean-Marc had been organizing the rear guard at the university and arrived late to a clearly tense situation. The wide streets was jammed with students and their sympathizers, perhaps approximately 7,000 people. Before Jean-Marc could reach them, they rushed the police and took control of the ministry steps. Most people obeyed when the police told them to disperse, but some 300 demonstrators elected to stay. In the milling and confusion, an army jeep was rolled over on its side and set on fire. Both sides in the political dispute know the power of a symbol. During that same period, anti-war protesters in the US were demonstrating against Vietnam. To Jean-Marc, the soldiers at that point seemed to lose control. He was among those that they arrested. But being born to a prominent family in a class-ridden country gave him certain privileges. Jean-Marc drew himself up when the first policeman approached. Jean-Marc presented his credentials as a reserve officer in the Brazilian Marines. He said, I can be arrested only by a Marine officer in the rank of captain or above. The perplexed policeman said, what the heck? And so he goes and asks for some assistance. The arrest made that day provoked another demonstration at which those who blamed the United States for Brazil's overthrow led a march to the U.S. Embassy. There they began throwing rocks at the embassy windows. They once again identified plainclothesmen in their midst and spotted other armed men on the embassy rooftop. From the ground, no one could say whether those security guards were from Brazil or the United States. They began shooting into the crowd. The number killed that day was never resolved. Jean-Marc's friends later showed him where two victims, a public official and a shopkeeper, were buried. Medical students and workers at the morgue calculated that perhaps 36 others were shot to death that day. Their estimate became more credible when an Air Force officer said that the rescue teams from the Air Force had killed many demonstrators that day, collecting their bodies and disposing of them in the ocean. After the shootings, the student leaders retreated to the university. But most of the demonstrators, including some of the wounded, rioted through the streets, shouting for that the government was guilty of murder. From noon until 9 p.m., fighting raged through the center of Rio. The police were equally out of control, shooting up office windows along a major boulevard. Where the police went, people flung down ashtrays, lamps, and chairs at them. One U.S. police advisor never forgot the sight of a policeman standing on the curb crying because he had been stoned. Eventually, with the police driven completely out of that corner of Rio, the demonstrators went home for dinner and Bloody Friday was ended. Jean-Marc heard about the riot from his jailers at the Army's 1st Armored Brigade. All day, the brigade had been on alert. When the wires to the headquarters were cut and the officers had no outside contact, it was a restraint, Jean-Marc learned, that had disappointed some Army officers. During his imprisonment, he was questioned at length by an Army colonel, Helvecchio Lette, who was notorious as a torturer. Lette threatened Jean-Marc with beatings and worse, but on the occasion, he was only blustering, and after the interrogation, he stayed on to discuss politics. According to Lette, President Silva had proved too weak to purify the country. Brazil needed a bloodbath, which should have come in 1964, when Lette and some fellow officers were ready to kill all of the resistance movement. However, Because Gouliard and his supporters had refused to fight, the opportunity was lost. He was bummed out about that. Rio's professors called their first protest meeting and sent their own delegates to the Minister of Education. The students set their largest demonstration yet for Wednesday. The demonstration, which lasted 5 hours, brought 100,000 people to the streets. The police at the army barracks and at the U.S. Embassy said that it looked like Brazil was on the verge of a civil war. Aristotle's Drummond, a little less than 4 years after the coup, was still fighting. Let's see, it says he also received word that the president wanted to speak with him. He took it as a joke, the only humor on that menacing day. Then Silva personally called him and said, "I want you at my office." Drummond boarded a military aircraft and flew to the capital with several other spokesmen. He spent an hour with the president, during which time Drummond assured him that Jean-Marc and other student leaders were absolutely unequivocally communist and all stops should be pulled out in order to hold them accountable. The next week was quiet, each side weighing the strengths and responses of the other. Believing the future of his government at stake, Silva agreed to meet with the delegation, one priest, one professor of psychology, and one student. The group drew up 4 proposals. Their vagueness caused Jean-Marc in his jail cell to despair. Jean-Marc was released pending his trial, the result of normal legal proceedings, not a gesture by Silva's to the demonstrators. 4 months later, Jean-Marc went on trial in a military court. The government had one star witness, the driver of the Jeep, who testified that he had heard Jean-Marc extorting students while the Jeep burned. He had done nothing of the sort. He wasn't even next to the Jeep when it was set on fire. Television films of the Jeep being set on fire showed Jean-Marc nowhere around it. When the court adjourned to deliberate, Jean-Marc was ordered to return for the verdict. From the tenor of the preliminaries, he was convinced there would only be one outcome. Besides, he was now running for presidency of the National Student Union, and that alone guaranteed him a guilty verdict. Consequently, he decided to disappear. His fellow defendant, who was also not guilty of any crimes, demonstrated his faith in the military justice by showing up for the verdict. He was sentenced to 2 years in jail. In absentia, Jean-Marc drew the same sentence. By then, it was September of 1968. A month later, the outgoing UNE leaders decided to hold a clandestine meeting at a farm, a town outside of San Pablo. Jean-Marc argued against the secrecy. Let the meeting be in public, he said, and let the police, if they dare, break it up. The resulting publicity would only win students more converts. By this time, the students had reached a private pact with the governor of San Paulo, who was a distant relative of Jean-Marc's. The governor had opposed the crackdown on the universities, and he promised the students security in his area. They faced a 3-hour walk to the farm, but for a secret march, there was a lot of singing and laughter. Army intelligence managed to locate them. Local commander called the governor and told him that the students were armed guerrillas. He was not completely wrong, because at least a couple of them had brought revolvers. Since the farm was next to a forest, they thought those guns could hold off any raiding party long enough for most of them to get into the woods. Jean-Marc argued unsuccessfully that that was going to be a bad thing. The army was threatening a massacre. To avoid that, Governor Sodre decided to arrest the students with his own police, whom he dispatched. When the students heard of the impending raid, there was panic. But the San Pablo State Police were even more terrified. They believed the propaganda that they were actually going to confront guerrillas. The police approached the farm shooting. Yet as they drew closer, there was no return fire. The students had decided that they were not gunfighters after all. They held their fire. The police rounded up the students and poured out stories of how scared they all had been, meaning the police. The police had no time for identity checks. Once in jail in Sao Paulo, the students learned that their arrest were already setting off street demonstrations all over. President Silva tried to lower the fever by announcing that although the students would be charged, the maximum possible number would be set free immediately, pending trial. Then, too, Governor Sodre was eager to diffuse the potential for riots in Sao Paulo by getting the prisoners from other states out of his jail and ordered his men to work around the clock to identify who they all were. Prior to the raid, Jean-Marc had been elected as the new president of the student union. Because he was also the only one among the 1,000 delegates that was technically a fugitive, his situation required more inventiveness. In case informers were describing him, Jean-Marc traded clothes with another student within the jail. Another gave him a pair of glasses, and he combed his hair with a part on the other side. The police knew he had been caught somewhere in their midst. The officers flew in from Rio with his photograph. As they approached the cells, the students banged on the bars and shouted ferociously at the Rio team, and they decided not to enter the cells, but wait instead until the squads of students were led out. It was 4 a.m. before Jean-Marc was brought from his cell for processing with 49 other students. He had concocted a false name to match his new appearance, and he claimed to be from the state of Parana, south of Sao Paulo. The governor there was reported to be reasonable, liberal. He thought he would get transported there. Jean-Marc heard an officer from Rio detail to say, "He's here somewhere and I'm going to find him." But as he said it, one of the police yawned and he passed by Jean-Marc without recognizing him. Once Jean-Marc reached the bus, he knew that in a few hours, better rested intelligence officers would be taking up the search. On the way there, he pushed the emergency exit and jumped off the bus and ran down the side of a street. He had accumulated the names of people who might help him. His first calls let him know that Cinemar, the Navy's intelligence section, had discovered that he had boarded the bus and officers were already checking all traffic in and out of the city. He didn't have a native accent to the area in which he was, so it was going to take a lot for him to keep away from the police. The next day, striking bank clerks had called a mass demonstration to be joined by professors, workers, and city poor. A cadre of students surrounded Jean-Marc and called on him to address the crowd. He was a wanted man, and he couldn't afford to be a celebrity. Twice he tried to speak, and each time a plainclothes officer in the crowd took a shot at him. Seeing the danger that he was posing to the other demonstrators, Jean-Marc slipped away to a friendly house where he had borrowed a suit and a tie. He borrowed a car and drove to the airport. Police were stationed at the train and bus depots and along the roads. They were making motorists get out of their cars so they could search their trunks. They were not watching the airport. Jean-Marc boarded a plane for Sao Paulo. Once lost in its industrial quarter, he lived the next year underground. Through the World in 1968 was a year of demonstrations. Back in Washington, Dan Miteron was finding the U.S. far different from the country he had left 8 years earlier. Brazilian students at the International Police Academy sometimes asked him why he had not stayed in Brazil. He would joke and say that he didn't want to forget that he was American. But the lawlessness he was finding at home troubled him deeply. The International Police Academy instructors in Brazil agreed among themselves that the streets at night were less dangerous than the streets of New York, and Miteron could feel that he had contributed to the quiet that had fallen across Brazil. Senator Frank Church's Foreign Relations Subcommittee began to probe the rumors of torture coming out of Brazil. The senators called in Brazil's chief U.S. police advisor and asked him if he felt safer in Washington, D.C. or Rio. The advisor, Theodore Brown, said, "I felt safer in Rio." Well, of course, because he had trained all the cops to kill all of the resistance. If that's the case, Senator Church said, then how is it we are also well qualified to instruct the Brazilians on adequate police protection methods? Because we weren't teaching them the same thing that the U.S. was teaching. If Nelson Rockefeller wondered what sort of young hooligan organized the protest demonstrations against him in the spring of 1969, one answer, sorry about that. Hush! Hey! My husband's coming back in the house. Nelson Rockefeller, was wondering about who had organized all the protests against him in 1969. One answer was none other than Jean-Marc. Rockefeller was still the governor of New York when Richard Nixon sent him to Latin America to prepare a policy report. The governor was scheduled to spend only a few hours in any one capital, but even the short duration, each day he was overwhelmed by protesters. In Latin America, the governor was not widely perceived as being a good guy because he represented one of the biggest foes in Latin America, and that was the Rockefeller family. Washington had pumped $2 billion into Brazil to protect U.S. investments, totaling only $1.7 billion. Let me say that again. You and I, our parents, spent $2 billion in U.S. government money in Brazil to protect Rockefeller's International Harvester, Goodyear, investment of $1.6 billion. In Latin America as a whole, the stakes were much higher, though. U.S. investors controlled 85% of Latin America's sources of raw material. 85%. U.S. investment had doubled from $6 billion in 1960 to $12 billion in 9 years. The Rockefellers' investment remained the most visible of all of those investments. So again, through USAID, Office of Public Safety, the CIA, overthrowing Latin American governments had increased investments in military dictatorships by $6 billion. At the time of the governor's trip, Standard Oil of New Jersey, part of the trust put together by the Rockefellers, controlled 95% of Venezuela's largest oil company. Below the equator, another Rockefeller family corporation, IBEC, which is the one that Nelson Rockefeller was most associated with, showed assets of over $50 million. There were also Rockefeller-controlled industries, banks, and supermarkets. Not unexpectedly, then, Rockefeller met with lots of riots in places like Colombia, Ecuador, Chile, Venezuela, and Brazil. In Ecuador, the police killed 6 students demonstrating against him. Given the scope of Rockefeller's inheritance and the hostile reception he received, the liberals of Brazil were not surprised that his report to Nixon followed a very hard line. According to Rockefeller, workers were largely under communist domination. Not "we hate you, Mr. Oligarch." They were possessed by the communist. He then went on to say the same was true of the students. The report praised the Hemisphere Police and its armed forces for keeping the peace that were trained by USAID's Office of Public Safety. The report also said the Army had enabled each country to deal with a growing covert communist threat to their internal security. There wasn't one. As for the police, the Rockefeller report chided the people of the US for not appreciating the importance of their role. True, the police had been used for political repression, and that was just unfortunate. But if anything, Rockefeller's report concluded the Latin American police must be strengthened. That spring, there was more than the Rockefeller mission to occupy Jean Marc. In February, the government had issued Decree 477 forbidding all political activity within the university. The authorities also closed most student centers. In Rio, only Catholic universities were exempt. Many student leaders were expelled. Jean-Marc found growing company in his underground network. Torture was also becoming systemic. In the early aftermath of the coup, a number of men and women had disappeared. Their bodies were later found in fields and gullies. The cases of torture had been isolated. A couple of actors, a former Army sergeant, Raimundo Suarez, tortured to death. Even the students were inclined to blame that torture on a few brutes among the police and military. Their respect for the presidency died hard. Though the office was now occupied by usurpers, the torture was far removed from the Brazilians' own view of themselves. They just couldn't believe their fellow Brazilians would torture their neighbors. In June of 1969, people in Sao Paulo were speaking guardedly about paramilitary organization called OBAN. Apparently, a collection of intelligence agents from the police and military had formed. In the war against them, OBAN considered itself to have a free hand, and its financing came from the industrialists that had come in as a result of the coup and the ones that had supported the coup prior to that. They were funneled through a man named Boylison. Jean Marc spent many months underground without being forced to resort to false documents. Challenged for identification, he would either show his Swiss passport or his card as a Marine officer. With a glance at either, policemen would wave him through. Twice, when Jean Marc's name was on the wanted list, he was scooped up in a police dragnet, but the officers failed to check each name on the list and he was let go. Jean Marc was hiding in a house of a physician who had been attending the president of Brazil. Jean Marc had heard that Silva had had a stroke from the doctor. He got so excited about that news that he set off to a house of some friends and he broke his own security rule of not going to any of those houses. It just so happens that it was a trap. And minutes later, the house was raided. Police on the street was watching the door, and when they seized him, Jean Marc told the officers that he was simply a student that had come to the wrong address. The government had discovered the random beatings created a climate of acquiescence at the universities, and the generals much preferred that stillness to the riots of the previous year. Jean Marc was taken first to the headquarters of the police, where he found 6 other suspects already waiting. For a half an hour, they were beaten on their kidneys with clubs. That was punishment for not answering questions. No questions had been asked. It was a preliminary lesson. Jean Marc was not blindfolded and was looking around. He saw 12 men in the room. Later, he learned that half of them was from Sinamar. The other half was from the police office who specialized in torture. The main Sinamar prison was in the basement of the Ministry of the Navy, near the docks of Rio's lovely harbor. Whenever possible, intelligence agencies on the 5th floor of the ministry waited to do their torturing at night when the staffs had gone home. U.S. Navy officers based at the naval mission in those same buildings would hear screams from across the courtyard. None of them ever did anything about it. Rear Admiral C. Thor Hansen, who told aides of overhearing the screams, raised the matter only once. He was told that it was internal business and to ignore it. There's no record of him ever saying anything to US officials. Sometimes they saw men, obviously fellow Brazilians, wearing civilian clothes around the intelligence office. If anyone was to object to the torture, it should have been them. Since the screams indicated that the torture was continuing, the information being gathered must be extremely vital to Brazil's security. Occasionally, Brazilians who had undergone torture at Sinamar managed to interest a foreign journalist in their ordeal. Once their story reached William Buckley Jr., supposedly a conservative columnist, as he toured Rio. They complained to him that they had heard English speaking voices in the rooms where the torture was being done. If they could hear conversations, why had the North Americans not heard the screaming? Buckley, who had once worked for the CIA in Mexico, reported later to his readers that there were radio monitors in the ministry. He said that what the prisoners had heard were, hold on a second. What the prisoners had heard was not actual US intelligence officers in the room, but a radio. Jean-Marc, when he heard Buckley's explanation, thought an excuse was so transparent that it should only confirm the accusation in a neutral mind. But who was listening, either to the charge or to Buckley's rebuttal? After being held at Sinamar, Jean-Luc was shipped across the bay to a prison on an island called the Isle of Flowers. And Bridget and I are very familiar with these island prisons because these island prisons was used in Korea and Vietnam and so many other places while they're doing their torture. A battalion of Brazilian Marines kept the building, and they also were part of the interrogation squads. For 24 hours, consecutive hours, Jean-Marc was beaten with clubs and shocked with electrical wires. At first, the torture was simply administrative, but on the third day, his captors discovered his identity, and the brutality of his beatings intensified. The island commander, Clemente Jose Montaro, Filho, a Marine commandant and graduate of the U.S. course in military intelligence in Panama, Montero came only twice to watch Jean-Marc's torture. The prisoners were blindfolded, but Montero's distinctive voice gave him away. Women who were imprisoned there were tortured after they were stripped naked. Among torturers themselves, there was a division, an acknowledgement that a few were sadists and others merely careermen doing their orders. One man who enjoyed his assignment tremendously was named Salamar Half. The other guards called him Dr. Bottle Opener for his skill at extracting the last bit of information from the most stubborn prisoner. Salamar seemed to be well versed in the use of drugs to get like the truth serum. He was not the leader. That man was Alfredo Pac, the Navy commander who had been so impressed by his U.S. training in psychological warfare at Fort Bragg. Pac tried to protect his reputation by using an alias called Dr. Mike. The assaults of these men on Jean-Marc astounded him. He saw how unprepared Brazilians in his generation was for psychological and political warfare. In Vietnam, fighting had gone on for a quarter of a century, and to be a young Vietnamese meant that you had psychologically been prepared for that. No one in Brazil was. Brazil had enjoyed, prior to this overthrow, 20 years of presidents and democracy. Torture had no place in their mind. He now found himself isolated in a room with men who let him know that they hated him and felt no trace of compassion for him. These men routinely wrapped wires around his penis and testicles, betraying no embarrassment in doing so. Jean-Marc had another stuck in. One of the leads was attached to his penis and the other one to his ear, and both were connected to a battery-operated field phone. Jean-Marc recognized the phone. His Marine unit had equipment just like it, supplied by the United States. The crank was turned, voltage leaped between the wires, shocking Jean-Marc. When they wanted to apply the shock to his mouth, a torturer first put a rubber glove in to hold the wire in place. Other times, wires were attached to his fingers with clothespins. Brazilians called the pins crocodiles because of their wooden jaws. Jean-Marc found it disturbing to see those harmless utensils that you see used commonplace in a home being used on him as torture instruments. There was another torture Jean-Marc hated even more. The guards took paddles, flat wood pieces with holes drilled in them that would have normally been used as a paddle. A swat or two would leave a nasty sting. However, the torturers used them for hours on end, beating him in the head, his kidneys, and his penis. Those beatings and shocks went on for 7 days, the first 4 without interruption. Jean-Marc was sure he wouldn't live through it. All of this supposedly for setting a Jeep on fire that he had nothing to do with and running. On the 7th day, blindfolded and beaten on the ears until his eardrums felt like they were going to burst, Jean-Marc learned the answer. He heard Commander Montero translating into English the questions to put to Jean-Marc. What group did you belong to? Where are its members? Jean-Marc also heard a man speaking to the commander in English with a U.S. accent. At the time, Jean-Marc was hanging upside down, trussed like a roasting chicken, his wrists and ankles tied to a pole called a parrot's perch. The guards were giving him electric shocks on the inside of his ears. Yet he heard the astonishing news and understood the frenzy that went into his beating. The U.S. ambassador to Brazil had just been kidnapped. So that's the end of that chapter, and that's where we're going to leave it.
I posted a few articles about the Diego Garcia, Chagos, Vietnam, and Brazil torture camps that were set up and trained by the CIA.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got a bunch of them. I mean, that was just the first three that popped off the top of my head.
Yeah. Yeah, we've definitely found a lot of them. Stellar, go ahead.
I am just so blown away because, I hear, the torture things. My father used to talk about, like, the drops on the head or whatever. Never in my I don't know, I guess I never thought that they would. Who thinks of these types of, like, I would never in my mind even think of, like, testicles to the ear, electrical thing. I mean, who thinks of these types of ideas? I mean, they have to be sick to even think of, like, these types of means. And holy crap, oh my gosh.
Well, to me, the most disturbing part of all of this is most of these were being taught to these people through the Office of Public Safety.
That's what I was meaning.
Yeah.
That's what I was meaning, because like, and then people would actually do that. Like you're getting trained to torture people with these means. I mean, that just, oh my gosh.
But you understand the psychological operation and how the designation of the term communist, just the designation of that term meant your life was in peril. You didn't have to actually even do anything. Because what you will find when you go into the research on this, someone who's rounded up in a student group of people meeting, it may be their first meeting they've ever went to, and they don't even know what they're getting into. Somebody could have just said, hey, I'm going to a meeting, you want to come with me? And that happens to be the time that it's rated. And these are people initially that just wanted their old government back with all of its flaws. They just wanted to be able to elect their own president. But the US oligarchs wanted what was in that country, and they unleashed this terror on the local people and didn't give a shit about what was happening to any of them, because Nelson Rockefeller spent a couple of hours in Brazil and said they were all communist. Stella, or
is that a way so that they could pick up on the people in these different villages that may possibly, not that they were going to go against the like the CIA or whatever, but a way to round up people that were not like hardcore into like what was happening, and possibility of dissent? Is that their way of rounding up people that were not happy with what was going on, you think, too?
Yes, that's the whole purpose. They want to root out any possible resistance to what they're doing. SR 71.
Thank you, Colonel. And thank everybody for attending here on X and on Rumble as well. 2 points. Who is it? Castillo Branco.
Uh-huh.
And his role in the coup, who thought he was going to become president. Turns out that he died in July of '67 in a plane crash. He was traveling in a Piper PA-23 Aztec aircraft, which collided with in midair with the T-33 jet. So, Air Force Lockheed T-33 jet. So there's that. Second is, I listened to everything that's going on here and what really happened and what's really happening. I can't help but relate a lot of this to what happened with January 6th. We talk about Jan 6 and how all of a sudden people are rounded up, they're thrown in jail, people have no clue what's going on. We know for a fact some of them were tortured as stories come out, or how they were treated. So it just boggles my mind that we would do that here.
Well, and it shouldn't, because the same people involved in January 6th are responsible for this being done all over the world. It was all, in my opinion, it was all done to perfect how they were going to do it here. It was never a question of whether it was going to be done here. It was a question of using all of these other places to perfect how they do it. That's the only conclusion that you can come to. Bridget, go ahead.
Just in case anyone has any questions, it was really kind of funny that the Office of Public Safety was part of the CIA. It just so happened someone apparently archived when the CIA's website was advertising for employment to go through to contact the Office of Public Safety.
So the Office of Public Safety wasn't technically part of the CIA. It was part of USAID.
But on the CIA's, someone archived a CIA website. They say contact the CIA, the Office of Public Affairs, which is the Office of Public Safety.
No, that's not the same one.
Okay.
Office of Public Affairs is their PR department.
Okay.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to look through the Office of Public Affairs too. So, well, like, I don't know. It's kind of like once you stumble on a blue car and every car is blue, you notice,
yeah.
anything that happens after World War II, it's immediately, you see it,
Right.
You can just, once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, Branco was actually the president of Brazil. I just wanted to make sure that people knew that. He was for a short time, and then it was Silva. So anyway, did anybody else have anything? Molly, did you want to say something?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, goody. Everybody needs to stop and think and get some perspective. That CAG Drago account, that excellent artist guy, always reposts the thing about Operation Warp Speed saved us from the FEMA camps they were planning. Get a perspective again of how President Trump being elected in 2016 interrupted their nasty, nasty plan. Because everything that you just read would be going on in this country more than it already is if he hadn't been elected.
Yeah, I don't think you can disagree with that. Because we were definitely headed there. Anybody else got anything? I don't even know where you find, obviously, just as the guy we were just reading about, he didn't even have it in his psyche, having grown up in Brazil, that his fellow Brazilians would do that. And yes, it is possible to find a few psychos that you could bring in to do that. But it wasn't just a few psychos that were doing it. There were people in their military doing it. And there were complicit people in the US military that was stationed there that heard it. And there, even something like what we were talking about on the Alpha Warrior show, where you have the commandant of the Marine Corps, because his Marines stationed in Lebanon was being abused by the IDF forces that were supposed to be there as allies, and they kept harassing. And that went up the chain of command in the Marine Corps instantly. And he wrote the letter to the SecDef and said that needs to stop immediately. And that was the lead up to the Beirut bombing of our where the Marines were. And that type of reaction should have been done. I cannot find anything. And usually those types of letters get archived. I looked everywhere. I can find no mention in either the National Archives. I have access to like Air War College as a graduate. I looked everywhere. I cannot find a single mention of any military personnel running up their chain of command that the Brazilian military was torturing people, other than the one guy, the one admiral making the comment one time to, hey, we're hearing all of these screams coming out of across the courtyard. What the hell are you doing? So to me, that would have been an international incident. If you want to imprison somebody because you think they're a communist and you basically have no proof that they're a communist, you just don't like their politics. It's one thing to put them in prison, sentence them to whatever it is for a political crime that you think's appropriate. But under no circumstances is it okay for you to torture them and use the techniques that they were using to torture another human being. It's just not acceptable. So I still, I have to scratch my head. I don't know how those kind of things, happen with other human beings. And not just that, I mean, we saw it in, Germany, where they imprisoned their own German citizens and tortured them. This is not a one-off thing. And that's the other aspect of this. Never forget that throughout Latin America during this exact same time, you have a whole bunch of former SS officers that were ratlined through the Catholic Church into Latin America as well. They are well placed, and a lot of them ended up being chiefs of police, government officials, and embedded into this infrastructure as well. It doesn't come out in this book, but we have throughout this, examination of these operations come across that throughout Latin America. SR 71.
Thank you, Colonel. And the observation of embedding all these people, I would say that's rampant here in the U.S. as well. But the other thing I was looking at was Rockefeller in 1968 and his personal holdings, or his holdings, and what he had. And it's become very clear as we go through everything that's going on here. All of these, our so-called oligarchs or Rockefellers, or the elite, so to speak, are highly dependent on the U.S. military to protect their interests. It's unbelievable how the CIA and how they get the U.S. military involved. It just,
So what I would,
don't know how we get to the point to say that man is the cause of it.
so let me say
He's
this.
the one that funded it. He's the one that did all the shit that we're involved in.
Let me say this. The U.S. military is the second order of effects. In many cases, there are, other than the military advisory group, which I'll give you that, there was the presence of military advisory groups, and that's, again, a very handful select people. Generally speaking, the first line of defending their resource, in foreign countries is the CIA. Many of these activities in the destabilization, up to and including coups, have no military presence. It is only when their unrest gets out of hand that it gets passed over to the U.S. military. And the U.S. military are given the same intelligence that the people back in the United States is given. They're told that there's a communist insurrection going on, and it is no longer containable by covert means. And I'm not trying to make excuses, but I want people to understand, just as we saw with the national intelligence estimate that was given or was produced, was all lies on President Trump about the Russiagate. They created out of whole cloth a laundry list of lies using the Steele dossier included in the estimate, which the thing was 100% fake. And they used that to hand off to the FBI to open investigations. The CIA does that same damn thing to the military. I watched it happen after 9/11. I sat in General Frank's staff meetings where the CIA briefed. And now that I know what really happened, every fucking thing that came out of that man's mouth was a lie. And it is based on that lie that our military gets committed to foreign countries and we die. And it all comes back to made up. And that's why I said there's no alternative, none, to the disposition of the CIA in total. Because people will ask you, well, who else is going to do the intelligence? The other 16 organizations that does intelligence that hopefully doesn't make shit up. But the CIA has two functions: to gather intelligence and to conduct covert operations. We've proven unequivocally they have no damn business doing covert operations. The shit that they do has killed millions of people. The intelligence that they supposedly gather is bullshit. They make it up on the fly to make it say whatever they need to in order to justify the covert operations they already have planned. Bridget?
Yes, the space tonight is at 9 p.m.
Okay.
And I pinned it in here in the Megatron.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you. Okay. So, enough of a soapbox. The CIA has to go. It has to be shattered into 1,000 pieces. JFK was absolutely right. It's secret bullshit that they classify, and it doesn't see the light for another 30 or 40 years. And by that time, you do the Hillary Clinton, what does it matter now type of thing. And no matter how gross the offenses are, when it does come out, there's nothing ever done about it. Generally, because the person's dead.
And see, that's where I have to disagree. Instead of shattering it to 1 million pieces, it needs to be incinerated. Because if you shatter it to 1 million pieces, we've seen with these organizations, they just go and reform under a different name. The same people, the same plans, the same organizations.
Yeah, but I can make that same argument about burning it down, because then you have the phoenix, right, that rises from the ashes.
Well, yeah, okay, right. Okay, now I'm going to go with Stellar. It needs to be burnt down, incinerated, buried, and then nuked, and then pooped on. That's pretty much it.
All right, we'll go with that plan.
We don't want to give it fertilizer, Bridget.
Oh, yeah, there you go. You're right. My bad.
All right.
We'll wrap it up in lead. We'll put it in a big lead box so nothing can penetrate it and stuff. And we'll make sure we say a prayer too, just to make sure that it's guarded with the proper authorities.
And launch it into a black hole.
Okay. Yeah, if I wanted them to be right about that whole other world, whatever that circle is that you can, the portal that you can go in, we can put it in there and seal it forever. Yeah, so anyway, all right, that's enough of that. So if we don't have any other,
I'm still boggled about these people that think of the torture stuff. I mean, those are the people that were probably, well, I used to pull legs out of spiders, but that would torture animals and stuff like that, and then grow up to be serial killers and stuff like that, and then trying to train people to do that on their own countrymen. I mean, it just boggles my mind that, I don't know.
But like SR-71 pointed out, you had FBI agents turning in January 6th. You had neighbors turning in January 6th. You had judges violating the Constitution and sentencing them to prison. You had doctors in prison withholding cancer treatment. So we have seen it firsthand here. There's no depths of depravity that these people will not go to. None. Which is why they can never be in control again, ever. So,
Well, I think that when all this stuff is done, anyone who did any of this stuff, whether it was, yes, they're doing it here, just like SR was saying, and when you put it into that perspective, it's like, holy crap. And then I started remembering, they had hotlines for even like COVID. If someone, if the restaurant had more than the amount of people in, or
yes,
wearing masks.
yes,
So yeah, it's the same thing like the Nazi times in Nazi Germany when the brown shirts were turning in, their neighbors, and even
yes,
their own, the kids turn on their parents.
yes, absolutely.
Adam in the house. Adam in the house.
What you got for us, Adam?
Hey, Colonel.
Hey.
I just wanted to congratulate you on what I heard yesterday on yours and Alpha's show. That you're going to be on Redacted and it's going to be long form rather than their usual show.
Yeah.
I'm so excited for you. That's so great. Congratulations on that. That's going to be great for the movement.
Thank you. And probably for the first time ever after I got the note from Natalie that it was actually going to happen, I sat down with my notebook to basically chart out an outline, and I was like, there's so much information. What am I going to talk about? Because it's so hard. It'll be probably about an hour long. Obviously, we don't want to waste any of the airtime. But it is such a big topic, the origins of it, dating back to the Fabian Society, the how the whole thing unfolded, because we've learned so much over the last 2.5 years. The cycle of pre-World War II, the oligarchs fielding their own intelligence and using a couple of examples of that and their own paramilitary force to rout out resistance in countries that they were in. And then the transferring after World War II to the CIA and a standing military for the first time in our country's history. And the use of that, and then the outsourcing of it to the military industrial complex and a corresponding element of the intelligence community, all owned by the same oligarchs. So we're paying for the operations and they're banking all of the profit off of them. So you can't leave any part of that out with and for someone to not understand the enormity of what we're talking about, because it's such a huge conglomerate. And if you don't get those basic pieces, you're not going to understand how widespread this is. And, again, we went through so many countries. And I just, as you guys saw my 5-part series on Iran, I just found the fact that Iran had stay-behind units before the coup of Mossadegh. I had no idea that happened. And I just found that. So, and that to me was mind-blowing. There's actual State Department cables of them training and equipping tribes in southern Iran as stay-behind units, giving them arms. And then, of course, you have the overthrow of Mossadegh. And then all of a sudden, just like what we did with the Kurds that we used several times for military operations and other things in Iraq, and then turn your back on them. That's what they did. They sentenced them to exile. The very people that were the biggest supporters of the United States in Iran, that the Rockefeller industrial complex used to train and equip in stay-behind units so that they could get some 20% of the revenue after the overthrow of Mossadegh from the British Petroleum. And we literally turned our backs on them. Not only did we turn our backs on them, with the Shah back in office, in charge, they actually attacked them and burnt down villages and made them move to city to urban areas where none of them had ever lived before, which is reminiscent of Vietnam. That's exactly what we did there. So it's just crazy. And every day spent doing this research and putting that information out is just mind blowing to me. And how I'm going to get all of that into an hour is weighing very heavily on
maybe
me.
They should do a series with you, like a 3-part series or something. You know, maybe it'd have to be a 10-part because it's so much information.
Yeah, well, I'm going to give it the college best that I can, and hopefully it's enough to get people, because the research is already there. Bridget has done a stellar job of putting that in that pinned post, and our Swedish buddy, whose name escapes me right now, and I apologize profusely for that every single day goes out there and grabs our spaces and puts them in that Google link to that box and stores all of our spaces, all of the information. Johan. Yeah, thank you. All of that information is there. And all we need to do is get eyes on it. Stellar, go ahead.
Do you remember last week or 2 weeks ago, I was telling you about that one autobiography series that I was watching about? Well, anyway, it was regarding the second wife that the Shah had, when he got married to her. He was exiled, brought back. During that whole thing, that's what you guys are talking about in that one series that I was watching. It does talk about the British Petroleum, the military, then how the communists came in, and then they ended up doing it back with the Americans and stuff like that, because they thought it was the lesser of the two evils. And then this, the second wife, her family, her father was in exile because they wanted the land and stuff like that. Back I guess decades before that, he was exiled, ended up marrying a German woman. And then that's where the two, that's where she ended up coming from. And then she got married and was the second wife to the Shah. And a lot of this stuff was going on during that, just like how they set up the protesters like Antifa. They did that it was just insane. But I was like, oh my gosh, that whole thing, the whole Iran thing, years early, even right before World War II or whatever. I mean, how they were trying to set everything up with the oil, and they wanted to own it. And it wasn't just, they wanted to, it was just insane, but completely that story is just what you guys are talking about. Her name is Soraya S. It's the second wife. I'll put it in the bottom of the thing, but her biography talks about all that stuff because that's where it all happened. But her family background is also her dad's family were exiled earlier when British Petroleum was coming in and divvying things up. It was the British people, imperialists or whatever. And then they weren't happy with that. And then he was going to nationalize. The Shah wanted everything nationalized, but that's where the colonialists didn't want it. He ended up partnering up with someone else that was friends with Stalin or something like that. And then there was that overthrow again. There was that overthrow part of it, but then he was put back in after that when he ended up teaming up with the Americans and stuff. But the big thing was that he wanted it to be nationalized, and profits going to the people of Iran. And it seemed like we had different ideas of Iran.
But Anglo-Iranian oil, wasn't it, Colonel?
Yes, but my problem with those documentaries is they don't understand that you mentioned that they used the communist threat. There was no communist threat. That's the whole thing. And many people, because of
it was based on her biography. I'm sorry.
I know, but Stellar, let me finish. I understand everything that you said, but my problem in watching those is there is a legitimacy that you give to actions that were taken when they're pitted against this fictitious communist threat. So there was no communist threat in Brazil. None. They made every bit of that up. People unionizing as students wanting better food is not communist. And in Iran, the Tuda party that was allegedly the Communist Party in Iran was made up largely of oil workers who were made to work anywhere from 12 to 16 hours a day for the in the oil industry, and they were not allowed to strike. They were not allowed to ask for better pay. They were not allowed to do anything. And the unionization of them and the support of that through the Tudeh party was immediately deemed communist. And even if you believe they're communist, there were 4,000 of them in the entire country. They were never deemed a threat, ever. And I just found a website I'm going through right now that has the entire list of State Department cables from Iran to the State Department and from the State Department back to Iran. They repeatedly said it's nil to non-existent, a communist threat. But here's what we're going to do just in case there is one. And for us that have been brainwashed through in the United States, when you hear information presented that there was a communist threat, everything that follows after that is legitimized as, oh my God, there was communist in Iran. The 4,000, and that's the best guess. That was like the max number that they estimated the strength of that political party as. And I forget, I posted it earlier today. There was over 10 million people in Iran. They had an entire military, and now we know a stay-behind unit. The Tudeh party was never a threat to anyone about anything. But it was used as a justification. It was labeled as a communist organization, and it was used as the justification for every action we did in Iran in the early 1950s. And I am now, I can't say this, and I don't mean to get overly excited about this, but I can't say strongly enough that the programming in the United States to basically equivalate everything that follows the use of the word communist to be grating on my nerves now. After 2 years of doing all of this research and boiling it down to negligible, even if it existed, to justify the torture that we just went through today because the guy happened to be in charge of the student union at a university. It's just ridiculous to me. And in many of these cases, Brazil included, Chile probably is the most notorious one, there's actually State Department cables of underlings in the State Department, not like the CIA station chief, that actually is providing alternative intelligence assessments and disagreeing with the assessment that a particular labor movement in a country had anything to do with communism at all. What I would love to be able to do at some point is actually go to Russia and look at their archives and look at what activity was actually happening. Because most of the time, what you find out through finding these other State Department CIA cables back and forth is them actually acknowledging that it really isn't there, but we're basically going to use it. SR 71.
Thank you, Colonel. And just so everybody gets an idea of what's going on, if you haven't watched the Colonel and Alpha Warrior show last night, the Gladio operations, they go into extensive detail and thoughts about how the American public has not only been, shall we say, primed with propaganda, but even when you're presented with new evidence, why you can't believe it. and what it takes to make you believe it. And when you finally wake up, the question that arose out of there was concerning China. What did you think of China before any of this? And what were you told? And anybody would say, well, okay, China's communist. We don't like communists, and they got this problem and that problem and the other problem, and you can't do this, and you can't do that. And then you come to find out that, oh, wait a minute. China's not really communist. People in China don't have half the problems we think they have.
So, but
the same goes for Russia. The same goes for all these other places. But your immediate thought I remember, to give you an idea, I remember when I was in the 4th grade, I was shown a film by Mrs. Orr, my 4th grade teacher, called China, The Great Awakening. And it was all about the dam being built on the river. And when the film was over, Miss Orr asked the class, who would like to go to China? And I raised my hand and said, yeah, I'd like to go to China. And you wouldn't believe what I got out of that as a 4th grader from Mrs. Orr. Saying, well, what do you think about that? No, you don't want to go there. You can't do this. You can't do that. It's unbelievable. That's the way we were raised, and that's what we've been taught. And until we begin to open our eyes and see differently, things won't change. Thank you, Colonel.
Sure. I just want to clarify. There are communists in China. There's a communist party in China, but it does not represent all of the people in China. And the government infrastructure that is communist in China is, as Alpha Warrior referred to it, the China deep state. And there are people, and there are that adamantly do not agree with their government, just like we had here during the Joe Biden administration. And we need to be able to not write off an entire country. And I really think that's kind of the beauty of what Trump has done he walked into North Korea. Who else is going to do that? And you basically have heard very little saber rattling out of North Korea since that occurred. Dealing with foreign policy through other means than covert operations is what the political and the State Department is supposed to actually be paid to do. The covert operations, the use of military, the use of economic warfare should be last resorts to any conflict anywhere. Diplomacy should be the first avenue of settling things. And the implementation of tariffs to deal with the economic piece of this, that should have been done by every single president, but it wasn't. And to me, I find everything that is going on right now, knowing all that I know, to be extremely refreshing, because we're actually using the State Department for what it was intended to be used for. And the elimination of the USAID, which is a CIA front, to do covert operations in foreign governments, has been dismantled. And I couldn't be more thrilled about that. Stellar, go ahead.
Okay, so when China started opening up to the West to come out there, they were not doing really well. There were only certain areas where the West was allowed to go. They had their own separate money. And if you went and they had their own tour guides and stuff like that, that would let, like say, Americans go to certain zones and things like that throughout China. It was very, very blocked off. I would say over the last 35 years, from back then to now, China's been cleaning up their stuff because of how much control that they had and would not allow, and people could not see it. I mean, you literally could not go there. If their tour guides had you go into those sections, because a lot of, like, I would love to go in those areas because you can get things a lot cheaper and stuff like that. But we had our own money that we spent that was Western money. It wasn't American money, but they had, you know, like the tourists had their own money set. They had their own areas that they could go to. You didn't have the freedoms that you do today in China and stuff like that. So when it was under the communist rule and when they started first opening up to the West, black and white compared to what it, I mean, we're looking more like how the tenements looked back then.
So, and that's a very interesting point, because China, as we demonstrated last night, was under constant attack by the West. We were fielding stay-behind units in Tibet and how do you say that one, Xing province, through Taiwan. We were conducting covert warfare against China, and China was not going to initially open areas where they knew the CIA had fomented their assets. They weren't going to open that up to the West. They were not going to allow, because the opening provided a greater access of people like the CIA into their interior. And they had just spent post-World War II up until, the 1970s under constant attack. And so they were very defensive about that opening up. What I find very interesting about all of this is, if you go back before World War II, people like C.V. Starr, the Tatas, and a lot of Indian, what are now oligarchs, the families are, the British all did business throughout China. And it took them a good bit to rid them of the Western influences, because they were not consistent with what China believed to be their culture. And regardless of the Communist Party piece of this, the restoration of their culture was very important to them. And, they had just been in a god-awful bloody war with Japan that went on for eons. They had Chinese people experimented on by that 731 unit there that the Japanese had. Basically, the stuff that had went on in Germany with the Nazis went on in China with the Japanese military. And so Stellar's absolutely right. They were very leery initially of opening up different parts of China. But of course, over time, the embracing of Western businesses into China began to occur, and we are where we are today. Molly, go ahead.
When you were talking about China, I'm not sure if you mentioned it last night on Alpha's program, but I had heard from a couple of different sources that it was actually Henry Kissinger that got them to institute that one-child policy. And, you're talking about the mindset we were given back in the day about, China, communist, horrible. And we used to be getting so much of the messages, too, about Islam. And through your research, you have come across so many places where different denominations of the Christian church have been infiltrated by these people. Even some of what we have heard in the church as Christians being persecuted, the actual cause of that is because they know that the intelligence agencies use the churches as a cover. So they think missionaries are spies. So just like you recognize that the shenanigans these evil bastards have been pulling puts every military person at risk. Also, they've put every Christian missionary at risk because nobody knows who the spies are.
So that is the blowback that occurs, the second, third order of effects, by using covert operations as a means of your forefront, quote unquote, diplomacy. Is it does put unsuspecting people at grave risk that they're completely unaware of. And no, I did not mention that Kissinger was behind that because I was unaware of it. But I will definitely look into that. Okay.
I'm shocked that I might know something you don't.
Honey, there's a lot of people out there that know stuff I don't. I have that happen to me every day in my DMs. People shoot me stuff that just blows me out of the water. So, yeah. Anyway. Okay. Anybody else?
Love you, lady.
Thank you, Molly. All right, you guys, I'm going to sign off. I'm going to finish my prep for our Cuba session on Spaces tonight at 9:00. And tomorrow we will do the secret societies at noon. And then I'll be back here at 4. So Adam, go ahead.
I was just going to ask when can we expect to see you on Redacted?
I don't know. Like okay. I said, we're recording it next week, and it's early in the week, but I will let you guys know as soon as they let me know when it's going to air, because I don't know anything about their scheduling or how they do their long forms or anything, but I will ask that question.
You're going to be a regular on there because as soon as you get started and all these connections, you're just going to be a regular on there, and everybody's going to get
once they get a taste of the kernel, they're going to want more.
We can expect a weekly broadcast, I'm pretty sure.
I can't
talking about because it doesn't end. I mean, everything is just, I mean, it's all connected, and everything that's going on right now, oh my God, absolutely. And you're going to be the best red pill for this country. Praise God. Thank you.
I can't commit to another weekly thing. Doing these things at 4:00 and Alpha Show and then the pop-up ones throughout the week. I'm like the prep work that goes into it's a lot. So I don't know about that. But anyway, I'm glad you guys have all that faith in me. But my husband probably is going to put his foot down at some point. Okay. All right, you guys, I'll see you tonight at 9:00. Thanks for being here. Appreciate it. All right, guys, thanks for being over here on Rumble. I appreciate it. You guys take care.